Well, hello my subscribers and any other poor soul that has fallen upon my channel. I do feel sorry for you. As you all know, I do gin and groan, wine and wines, those kind of things, and my friend in England, Church House Classics, does beer and bollocks. This is not going to be one of those, believe it or not, although I do have a gin and tonic in my hand. This is going to be old fart mechanic tips. I won't say that they're perfect. I won't say that they're the only way. What I will say is they are things that I have done over the years, things I've discovered over the years, knowledge I've learnt from other mechanics, and I'm still learning today. So, but before I get into that, can anyone out there answer me this very simple question? When did door panels become door cards? Ever since I was born, they were called door panels. Now it seems that people have no brains and they keep calling them door cards. I don't know why. I'd love to know why. I'd also like to know when it changed. Anyway, let's move on to mechanical tips. Let's do something with brakes. Let's start with brakes. When you're bleeding the brakes, you all know you start from the furthest away and then get to the nearest to the reservoir, which is fine. What a lot of people don't realise is that by cracking that brake bleed nipple, you can introduce air when you're holding it. Air can get in. My suggestion is get some PTFE tape, take the brake nipple out, wrap it around the thread, making sure you don't cover that little hole, and screw it back in. Now you could use grease, you could use gasket sealant, you know, but they're messy. The PTFE tape is great for when you're bleeding the brakes. Now I'm not saying it won't break down and disappear afterwards, but that doesn't matter because by that time you've got it tight. So it's not a problem. But using that PTFE tape around the threads will stop any air getting back in the system when you're pumping the pedal. Pad removal. This one kind of depends a lot on the caliper. If you're using or working on a single pot caliper, so the piston is on the inside and on the outside you have a fork in effect, you can use a G-clamp, and you get that G-clamp between the forks, the twisty bit, and then the rest around the back, and then you just wind it and wind it and wind it and wind it, and it will crush the piston back and therefore make it easier for you, A, to remove the pads, and B, put in the new pads. And obviously prior to putting in the new pads, you should get yourself some brake grease. I use copper grease, it's one of my favorites, and put it where metal touches metal. So on the fork, I'll put it on the two faces of the fork, and on the piston I'll put it on the ring of the piston, and then also on the caliper bracket where the pads slide back and forth, I'll clean that up and put a little bit of grease on there. Don't go crazy, because the last thing you want is grease all over your rotor. So that's one of the ways to do it. Rear brakes, again, depending on the vehicle. Some of them you can use that method to wind in the piston. Others, be very careful. They'll have a cross on them, on the piston. They have to be wound in. If you crush them in with a G-clamp, C-clamp, whatever you want to call it, you will damage it, and then you'll be fucked. The reason they do it that way, as far as I can see, is so that when you pull the handbrake on, and yes, it's a handbrake, not an emergency brake, when you pull that on, it makes an adjustment so that the brake pads are closer to the rotor, so that when you use the hand brake or you put your foot on the brake, the pads don't have to travel far. So be very careful of that when you're working on cars. Fords, I know, are particularly renowned for doing that. The other thing, if you're doing brake shoes, and most of you probably wouldn't even know what a brake shoe is, it is always best to chamfer the leading edge. So as the rotation is this way on the drum, you chamfer that edge, and then at the bottom you chamfer that edge with the shoes like that. That way you get less brake noise. But don't forget, when you're replacing the shoes, the shoe rubs against the metal plate at the back. So clean that up. They're like little raised parts on the shield at the back. Clean that up, put a little bit of grease on it. Believe me, it'll reduce the amount of noise. Excuse me 1 second, gotta have a sip. Transmissions. There are, unfortunately these days, various methods for changing transmission fluid. And I would suggest, for your particular vehicle, look on YouTube. If you're doing a CVT transmission, there is usually not a dipstick. Very rarely you'll find it on a CVT transmission. And the usual method is to drain it into a container, measure the amount you put out, and put the same amount back in. Whilst that is an okay method, I always like to try and figure out what it should have. If you're doing a CVT and you drain out 4 quarts, when really it should have 5 quarts in it, I'd rather put the 5 quarts back in. So be very careful with that. If you're working on a transmission such as on Jaguars, Mercedes, and I also believe BMW, but don't quote me on that, and I'm sure other vehicles, they've got what's called the ZF transmissions, or as Americans would say, ZF. Now these usually don't have a dipstick, usually, and the only way to get the transmission level correct once you've changed the filter, and with some of them you have to replace the whole pan at the bottom to replace the filter. I think that's true of Jaguar, not sure about the others. The only way to get the fluid level correct is to run the engine to a certain temperature, measure the temperature of it with a infrared gun, and pump fluid in through an awkward hole to get to underneath, and this is all done underneath the car. And when it starts to flow out, then you put the plug in. If, however, it gets too hot, you have to stop and wait for it to cool down. Yeah, it's a real tricky one, that. Bit of a pain in the ass. Again, always look at YouTube, see if you can find someone that's done it, and learn from them. The other, what was I going to say? Brain cell just died. Bugger. Other transmissions, sorry. When you've done your filter change, and this is on a normal transmission with a normal dipstick, and you've run it and you get it up to temperature, and you jump in the car and say, yeah, okay, oh sorry, no, you don't jump in the car, you dip in your dipstick, which could make your eyes water sometimes. Got your dipstick in the hole, and yeah, that fluid level's correct. No, it's not. Get in the car, put your foot on the brake, run through the gears, every one of them. Twice is my preference. Then, still with the engine running, check the level. You'll be surprised how different it can be. Also, a little bit of a word of warning, sometimes with AF transmissions and ones that use AF transmission fluid, changing really dirty fluid can sometimes cause problems. Very rarely, but do bear that in mind. Right, CV axles. If you're replacing a CV axle, do be very, very careful when you're pulling it out of the hub. Don't pull the axle. Now, let me go back a bit here. If you're replacing it, it doesn't matter. But if you're replacing something else, such as a strut, a rotor, things like that, and it means you have to disconnect the CV axle from the hub, make sure you keep that CV axle pressed in to the gearbox or the transmission. If you don't, the CV axle, which has its coupling, can part. Then you have no drive and you have a fucked up CV axle and you've got to go buy a new one. So do be aware of that. Okay, one more sip. Just a few more little things. Cheap tools. Depends on what it is. I have a variety of tools. I would say probably 90% of my tools are Snap-on. Why? They're very expensive, yes. They, generally speaking, are the best. And also, should you break one, Snap-on are pretty good about just replacing it at no cost. I have broken a few wrenches in time, usually the ratchet wrenches, and I call up Snap-on and say, hey guys, you know, the ratchet stopped working, this piece fell off, whatever. No problem, Mr. Mees, we'll send you another one. Oh, okay. What do you want me to do with the old one? Just throw it away. So it means you've still got a wrench that might or might not work, but Mr. Snap-on will replace it and give you a nice new one. I had a problem with my ratchet wrench, and they just sent me a new ratchet kit to put in the wrench. Great, no charge, terrific. You know, obviously they could see that I've bought quite a few Snap-on pieces of equipment, and of course, you know, if it happens to be your first purchase with them and it breaks, they're still going to send you the replacement. Now, I do have some other tools which are cheap, and they're great for, I can't get into that corner, so let me heat up a wrench and bend it, which is good. You know, Craftsman, Harbor Freight ones. The Harbor Freight ones, generally speaking, will break, unfortunately. You don't buy a precision tool from Harbor Freight. You'll buy things that really don't have a precision item in them. Some of their impact stuff is pretty good, I must admit. I've not had a problem with it. So, and that's a point. Project Farms, a guy has a YouTube channel called Project Farms. He does lots of testing, and he did a lot of testing on wrenches. Snap-on didn't win, I will put my hand up and say that. Not in every category, but it certainly did in some. It's worth checking out. So yes, you don't always have to buy Snap-on, but maybe it's a snob value thing, I'm not sure, but they certainly seem to be some of the best tools out there. Special tools, well, again, there are certain special tools that I would not pay Snap-on prices for. You know, something for removing a steering pump pulley. You know, you might as well go to your local AutoZone or O'Reilly, or even O'Reilly, and rent the tool. Unless you're going to be doing it quite a bit, which I tend to do, so I just buy the tools. You know, it's just simpler that way. That's your choice. Plastic plugs. Pardon me. I have saved every plastic plug that I have taken out from the master cylinder, CV axle, anything that's got a plastic plug in it, and stuck it in a jar. Then when you're painting something or working on something and you don't want crap to go in the hole, or you're just storing it, you find an appropriate plug and plug up the hole. It's great. I've got a huge jar full of it. In fact, the jar that I used had those, what do they call them, cheesy balls? Big jar, about yay tall. Of course, it does mean you have to eat all the cheesy balls, but It's better than the ladies eating your cheesy balls, isn't it? Okay, nuts and bolts and washers and screws, those kind of things. I, again, have saved every one that I have taken off of something, and I ended up, let's say I got a tie rod end and it comes with a new nut, comes with a new grease nipple. I keep them, put them in a jar. You know, nuts in one, bolts in the other, wash it in another. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Throat got a little dry here. So yeah, keep the nuts and the bolts and the washers and screws and everything. And I just find it handy to put them in separate jars, depending on how big a jar you need. And then, you know, when you're working on a job and you need a spring washer, a star washer, a plain washer, something nut, or something bolt, or something screw, you can go to that relevant container, and more often than not, you will find what you need. One other thing I do, which is very bad, I must admit, is I'll be working on a job and I don't have that particular nut, washer, bolt, whatever it is, and I go to my local hardware store and I need 4 of them, so I buy 6. And then, you know, top up my storage stock level. Okay, one last thing, which is another piece of advice, and the only reason I'm saying this now is because I did it today. I was a prick, I was an idiot, I wasn't thinking. I had drilled a hole in my Mark II Jaguar here, and I put a riv nut in, and I was securing a cable. When I pushed the bolt in, I got it at a slight angle. Again, I wasn't aware of that, but I got my wrench on it and I'm turning it and it gets tight. And I think, that's all right, it'll straighten up. And I cranked on it. It didn't straighten up. It cross-threaded. Then the riv nut spun in the hole, which of course it would. They're not super duper strength, you know, you don't use riv nuts if you want a real hard, strength driven securing. You use, I think they're called flange nuts. I'm not sure on that, you'd have to look that up. But they spread out and they bite harder and they won't let go. So anyway, I was stupid, no two ways about it. I got it at an angle and I just cranked on it and the fucker, nah. So then fortunately it was on an area I could get to, and I had to get a clamp on the other side, and then I could undo the nut, and then I had to drill out the old riv nut and then put a new riv nut in, and then made sure I lined it up properly with my new bolt in the riv nut. So you know when you're working on something it's not right to do what you're about to do. So don't do it. We've all done it. I hope I won't do it again. I really cursed myself when I did it. It was my own stupid fault. So that is just some of the things I have learnt in my years as a mechanic. Christ, probably something like 68 years wrenching. And no, you know, I'm talking about, you know, when I started wrenching on my bicycle when I was a kid. And it's just one of those things that you do. And I will put my hands up now and say I'm still learning. You know, such as one other thing, when you're trying to separate a tie rod end, a lot of people use the pickle forks. And that, you know, they work, but they do tend to destroy the boot. And if you're not replacing it, you just want to take it off, the 2-hammer method works. You undo the bolt, you put one hammer one side of the area where the tapered part is in the joint, and then you use the other hammer and hit on the side. And the shock will make it release. It may take 2 or 3 blows, but it will usually make it release. Same as when you're trying to undo a bolt and it really doesn't want to come, and you've put, you know, your penetrating oil, etc. on it, and it won't come out. Instead of undoing it, give it a quick do-up movement and then try undoing it. Quite often that works. If not, heat is your friend. Believe it or not, once you put heat on things, 99% of them will come undone, and of course you have to be careful because of the flame. All right, that's it. It was just something I thought I would like to do for you people. Hopefully you'll find it useful. If you've got another useful tip, chuck it in the comments. Let us all learn. That could be great. We could all learn from each other. Thank you, good night, and get out in that garage, do some shit.